It was a sunny Tuesday afternoon when it all began. The light filtered through the lace curtains of my living room, scattering patterns across the coffee table where I'd carelessly left a book I now regret placing so brazenly in plain sight. The cover was striking, crimson letters spelling out a title that left little to the imagination. Desires of the Middle-Aged Heart. I was in the kitchen preparing tea when Julian walked in. He wasn't supposed to be home. College classes usually kept him out until late evening, but there he was, tall and lean, with that boyish curiosity that always made him look younger than his 21 years. He paused by the table, his gaze locking onto the book. I caught the moment from the corner of my eye, his brow furrowing in surprise before one of his lips curled upward in what could only be described as a smirk. "Interesting choice," he remarked, holding up the book. His tone was casual, but his eyes flickered with amusement. Or was it something else? I felt heat creep up my neck. "It's research," I lied, turning to face him. "I'm editing it for a client." "Really?" He flipped through the pages, skimming a paragraph before closing it with a deliberate snap. "Looks more like inspiration than research." I laughed, though it came out too forced to be convincing. "Don't judge a book by its cover." But his smile lingered, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was judging much more than the book. He set it back down, his fingers brushing against the table for a fraction of a second longer than necessary, before walking away with that same smirk. As the door to his room clicked shut, I exhaled, trying to steady the unease bubbling in my chest. It wasn't the book itself that bothered me. It was how he looked at it. At me. Like he saw something I wasn't ready to acknowledge. That moment marked the beginning of something I never anticipated. Something I couldn't have stopped even if I'd tried. Looking back, I wonder if I left the book there on purpose. If some part of me wanted him to find it, to look at me in a way that no one else had in years. My days had fallen into a predictable rhythm. Mornings started with a steaming cup of coffee, followed by hours spent hunched over manuscripts. My red pen circling errors and suggesting improvements. Being a freelance book editor had its perks. Flexibility, solitude, but it also left me craving something I hadn't quite been able to name. Perhaps that's why I'd been so careless with the book that Tuesday. Julian had moved back in a few months earlier. He needed a place to stay while finishing his final year of college, and I couldn't refuse. It was a big house, far too empty since Charles, my late husband, passed away. I told myself it was nice having someone around again, even if Julian and I had never been particularly close. Our interactions were polite but sparse. He was often buried in his coursework or out with friends. I gave him space, and he returned the favor. But after the book incident, something shifted. The following morning, as I sat at the dining table editing a particularly dull manuscript about corporate leadership, Julian walked in. He was wearing sweatpants and a t-shirt, his hair still messy from sleep. I barely glanced up, expecting the usual quick grab of cereal before he disappeared. Instead, he lingered. "About that book," he started, leaning casually against the counter. I froze, my pen hovering over the page. "What about it?" He shrugged, but his eyes betrayed a spark of curiosity. "I looked it up. Seems different from the stuff you usually work on." I sighed, setting the pen down. "Not every project can be thrilling, Julian. It's just another job. Right?" He nodded, but didn't leave. Instead, he poured himself a cup of coffee and sat across from me. "So what's it about?" I hesitated, unsure of how to answer. "It's a novel about relationships, exploring connections later in life." "Relationships, huh?" He smirked, and I felt my cheeks flush. "Yes," I replied sharply, hoping to end the conversation. But Julian didn't seem deterred. "You know," he said after a long sip of coffee, "I think people underestimate how complex relationships can be at any age." His tone was casual, but there was something in the way he spoke that made my stomach twist. I forced a smile, brushing off his comment as a passing observation, but as the days went on, I noticed him watching me more closely. One evening, I caught him in the living room. He was sprawled out on the couch with his laptop, but on the coffee table sat my book. He wasn't reading it, but its presence there felt deliberate, like a silent challenge. "Are you enjoying my things now too?" I asked, half joking as I entered the room. He glanced up, unbothered. "Just curious, you left it out again." I crossed my arms. It's not exactly your type of reading material. Maybe I'm expanding my horizons. His eyes met mine, and for a brief moment, the room felt too small. I tried to laugh it off, muttering something about him needing to expand his horizons elsewhere, but the tension didn't dissipate. If anything, it lingered, growing heavier with each passing interaction. By the end of the week, I started catching myself thinking about Julian at odd moments. It wasn't just the way he looked, though he was undeniably handsome with his sharp features and confident posture. It was his sudden attentiveness, the way he seemed to notice things no one else did. Like the day he commented on my hair. I'd spent a little extra time brushing it out, hoping to feel less invisible. "Your hair looks nice like that," he said as he passed me in the hallway. It was a simple remark, but it caught me off guard. "Thank you," I replied, my voice quieter than I intended. These moments were small, insignificant on the surface, but they piled up like drops of water filling a glass. I told myself it was nothing, that I was overthinking. But deep down, I knew something had shifted between us. The household wasn't as quiet as it used to be, and it wasn't just because Julian was home. It was the unspoken words, the lingering glances, and the way my pulse quickened when I caught his eye. It was late one evening when I found Julian in the living room again. The house was quiet, the only sound the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. I had been working in my study but decided to stretch my legs and get a glass of water. Passing by, I saw the glow of a lamp illuminating his face as he sat on the couch, the book open in his hands. For a moment, I froze in the doorway, my breath catching. He hadn't just been flipping through the pages. He was reading it, his brow furrowed in concentration. I could see the slight movement of his lips as he silently mouthed the words, an unconscious habit he'd had since he was a boy. "Interesting bedtime story?" I asked, leaning against the frame, trying to sound nonchalant. He looked up, startled but quickly recovered. "It's different," he admitted, closing the book but keeping his thumb between the pages. "A lot more honest than I expected." "Honest?" I raised an eyebrow. Stepping into the room, he nodded. "Yeah, it's raw. About love, attraction, all the messy parts people don't talk about." I sat down in the armchair across from him, crossing my legs and pretending his words didn't stir something inside me. "That's the point of good writing, Julian, to explore the things people are too afraid to say out loud." "And you're comfortable with all of this?" His eyes locked on mine, his tone probing. I hesitated. "It's not about comfort, it's about understanding perspectives, even if they make you uncomfortable." For a moment he said nothing, his gaze steady. Then, almost casually, he asked, "Do you think people can feel that kind of passion at any age?" I was taken aback, unsure of how to answer. "I think passion doesn't have an expiration date. Why do you ask?" He shrugged, but there was something deliberate about his nonchalance. "Just curious. It's not something people my age think about much." "You'd be surprised," I murmured, the words slipping out before I could stop them. Our eyes met again, and the air between us seemed to shift, charged with something unspoken. I quickly stood, brushing imaginary lint off my sweater. "Don't stay up too late. You've got class in the morning." "Good night, Eleanor," he said softly, his voice carrying a weight that followed me down the hallway. The next day, I found myself replaying our conversation, dissecting his words and their possible meanings. Was he simply curious, or was there something deeper lurking beneath his questions? That evening, as I sat at my desk trying to focus on a manuscript, I heard a knock at the door. Julian stepped in, holding 2 mugs of tea. "I figured you could use a break," he said, setting one down beside me. "Thanks," I said, surprised. He lingered, his hands in his pockets. "Can I ask you something?" I nodded cautiously. "That book. Why did you decide to work on it? I mean, you could have passed it off to someone else, right?" I hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. "It's personal, I guess. Not the content, but the idea of it. I think people deserve to see themselves reflected in stories no matter their age." "That makes sense," he said, pulling out a chair and sitting across from me. "But does that mean you see yourself in it?" His question caught me off guard, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. "I think everyone can relate to some part of it," I said carefully. He didn't press further, but the look in his eyes told me he wasn't satisfied with my answer. Over the next week, Julian's curiosity only grew. He started asking me questions about other books I'd worked on, about my thoughts on love and relationships. At first, I chalked it up to his inquisitive nature, but as his questions became more pointed, I couldn't ignore the undercurrent of something more. One afternoon, I caught him staring at me while I was reading on the patio. He was supposed to be studying, but his textbook lay forgotten on his lap. When I looked up, he didn't look away. "You're distracted," I said, trying to keep my tone light. "Maybe," he admitted, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Is something on your mind?" He hesitated before answering. "Do you ever think about starting over? Finding someone new?" The question was so unexpected that I didn't know how to respond. "That's complicated," I said finally. "Life usually is," he replied, standing and heading inside before I could say anything more. As the days passed, I found myself increasingly aware of Julian's presence. His questions, his glances, the way he seemed to hang on my every word. It was as if he was peeling back layers I hadn't realized were there. And I couldn't deny it. I didn't hate the attention. The air had been charged between us for days now, though neither of us acknowledged it outright. The unspoken tension lingered like a static current in the house, growing stronger with every shared glance and stolen moment. That Saturday, I decided to tackle some long-overdue organizing in the library. Books were scattered across the shelves, a chaotic mixture of old novels, college textbooks, and various anthologies I'd collected over the years. I had just finished sorting a stack when Julian walked in, barefoot and casual in jeans and a gray t-shirt. "Need a hand?" he offered, his tone light. "Sure," I said, brushing a strand of hair from my face. "But I'm warning you, this is a full-day project." "I've got time," he replied, stepping closer. We worked side by side for hours, exchanging easy conversation about everything from his classes to my editing projects. The tension that had clouded the air earlier seemed to dissolve as we focused on the task at hand. It felt almost normal, the kind of comfortable interaction I'd long since stopped expecting. But that comfort didn't last. As I reached for a book on the top shelf, Julian stepped forward to help. His hand brushed against mine, lingering longer than necessary. The warmth of his skin sent a jolt through me, and I pulled back as if burned, clutching the book to my chest. "Sorry," he murmured, though his voice was soft, almost tender. "It's fine," I said quickly, turning away to hide the flush spreading across my cheeks. But it wasn't fine. That brief touch had awakened something I'd been trying desperately to ignore. My heart raced, my skin tingled, and every nerve in my body seemed to come alive in a way it hadn't in years. After that moment, things changed. Julian became more attentive, finding reasons to be near me. He offered to help with chores, brought me coffee in the mornings, and lingered in the kitchen while I cooked. His presence was both comforting and unnerving, and I couldn't tell if it was intentional or if I was imagining it. One evening, I found him in the living room, sketching in a notebook. "I didn't know you drew," I said, sitting on the arm of the couch. "It's just a hobby," he replied, turning the page so I couldn't see. "Let me look," I teased, reaching for the notebook. He hesitated but handed it over, his expression unreadable. The drawings were beautiful. Portraits, landscapes, moments captured in delicate lines and shadows. But one sketch made me pause. It was a woman, her back turned, hair cascading down her shoulders. "It's stunning," I said, running my fingers over the edge of the paper. "It's you," he said quietly. I looked up, my breath catching. "Me?" he nodded, his eyes meeting mine. "I've been drawing you for weeks. You're inspiring." The room felt smaller, the air heavier. I handed the notebook back, unsure of what to say. "Thank you," I managed, my voice barely above a whisper. The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotion. I couldn't stop thinking about him. His touch, his words, the way he looked at me as if I were the only thing that mattered. It was intoxicating and terrifying all at once. One afternoon, I decided to confront him, to put an end to whatever was happening before it spiraled further out of control. I found him in the kitchen, leaning against the counter with a glass of water in hand. "Julian, we need to talk," I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside me. "Okay," he said, setting the glass down and giving me his full attention. Whatever this is, it has to stop. It's not appropriate." He frowned, his brows knitting together. "I don't understand. What are you talking about?" "You know exactly what I'm talking about," I said, my tone sharper than I intended. "The looks, the touches, the everything. He stepped closer, his expression softening. Eleanor, I'm not doing anything you don't want. My breath hitched as he reached out, his fingers brushing a stray hair from my face. If I'm wrong, tell me to stop, he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. I should have pulled away, should have told him he was wrong, but I couldn't. My body betrayed me, leaning into his touch as if it had been waiting for this moment all along. Julian, I began, but whatever protest I had died on my lips as his hand cupped my cheek. It was wrong. I knew it was wrong, but as his lips met mine, all the reasons why seemed to fade, replaced by a heat that consumed me. When I finally pulled away, my mind was a whirlwind of guilt and desire. This can't happen again, I said, my voice trembling. Why not? He asked, his tone calm but firm. Because it's not right. Then why didn't you stop me? I had no answer, no defense against the truth in his words. I turned and walked away, but even as I left the room, I knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The tension in the house had reached a breaking point. Every glance, every accidental touch, every word exchanged between us seemed to carry more weight than it should. I avoided being alone with Julian as much as possible. But it didn't matter. His presence was everywhere. In my thoughts, my dreams, my waking moments. It was a rainy evening when the line was finally crossed. The sound of water pelting against the windows filled the silence as I sat in the kitchen, nursing a glass of wine after a frustrating day. My work had been rejected by a particularly difficult client, and the weight of it all was pressing down on me. I didn't hear Julian enter until he was already standing in the doorway. You okay? He asked, his voice soft. I looked up, startled, but quickly composed myself. I'm fine, just a rough day. He stepped inside, his socks muffling his footsteps. Want to talk about it? I shook my head, trying to avoid his gaze. No, it's nothing. He didn't leave. Instead, he pulled out a chair and sat across from me, his eyes searching mine. You've been distant, he said after a moment. I've been busy, I replied, though even I could hear the lie in my voice. Eleanor, he said, his tone gentle but firm. Talk to me. I sighed, leaning back in my chair. It's complicated, Julian. Work, life, everything feels so heavy lately. He reached out, his hand covering mine. You don't have to carry it alone. His touch was warm, grounding, and for a moment I allowed myself to lean into it. I've been carrying things alone for a long time, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. You don't have to anymore, he said, his thumb brushing against my knuckles. The words hung between us, heavy with unspoken meaning. I looked up at him, and for the first time, I let myself see him, not as my stepson, but as the man he had become. Julian, I began, but he interrupted me, his voice low and steady. Tell me to leave, and I will, but if you don't want me to. He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't have to. The choice was mine, and I knew what I wanted, what I'd wanted for weeks but had been too afraid to admit. I didn't tell him to leave. The first kiss was hesitant, a soft meeting of lips that sent a shiver down my spine. I pulled back, searching his eyes for doubt or hesitation, but there was none. He looked at me with a certainty that both terrified and thrilled me. When he kissed me again, it was deeper, more urgent. His hands found my waist, pulling me closer as the world outside seemed to fade away. My glass of wine tipped over, spilling red liquid across the table, but neither of us cared. We didn't make it to the bedroom that night. The kitchen became our sanctuary, our secret, as we gave in to the desire that had been building between us for so long. The next morning, I woke up in my own bed, the events of the night before, replaying in my mind like a dream. But it wasn't a dream. The lingering warmth on my skin, the faint scent of him on my pillow, they were all too real. I told myself it was a mistake, a moment of weakness that couldn't happen again. But when Julian walked into the kitchen, his hair damp from a shower and a small smile playing on his lips, I knew it wasn't that simple. Morning, he said, his tone casual. Morning, I replied, my voice wavering. He leaned against the counter, watching me with an intensity that made my pulse quicken. Are we going to talk about last night? There's nothing to talk about, I said quickly, turning my attention to the coffee pot. Eleanor. His voice was soft, but it carried a weight that made me stop. Don't pretend it didn't happen. I turned to face him, my arms crossed defensively. What do you want me to say, Julian? That it was a mistake? That it can't happen again? Was it a mistake? He asked, his eyes locking onto mine. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. I didn't know how to answer him, because deep down I knew it hadn't felt like a mistake. It had felt inevitable. Over the next few days, we danced around each other, caught in a limbo of desire and denial. Every touch, every glance, every accidental brush of skin only added fuel to the fire. One evening, as I worked late in my study, Julian appeared in the doorway. "Can I come in?" he asked. I nodded, unable to find my voice. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "I can't stop thinking about you," he admitted, his voice low and filled with emotion. "Julian, we can't." "Why not?" he interrupted, stepping closer. "Because it's wrong? Because you're afraid of what people will think? None of that matters to me, Eleanor. You matter." His words broke through my defenses, and before I could stop myself, I was in his arms again. This time there was no hesitation, no second guessing. As the night stretched on, the boundaries we had once adhered to disappeared entirely. The days following that night blurred together into a haze of stolen moments and quiet longing. What had started as an impulsive decision, a kiss in the kitchen on a rainy evening, evolved into something neither of us could stop. Julian and I were drawn to each other like magnets, the pull too strong to resist, no matter how wrong it felt. We became masters of secrecy. Our relationship existed in the shadows, hidden behind locked doors and whispered conversations. When the house was empty, we'd find each other in the quiet corners, where no one could intrude. My office became our sanctuary, a place where we could exist without judgment, even for a little while. I'd sit at my desk, pretending to work, while Julian stood behind me, his hands resting lightly on my shoulders. Sometimes he'd lean down, his lips brushing against my neck, sending shivers down my spine. Other times he'd kneel beside me, his fingers tracing patterns on my arm as we talked about everything and nothing. One particularly warm afternoon, Julian suggested we go for a drive. "Somewhere away from here," he said, his eyes bright with excitement. We ended up at a secluded park on the edge of town, where the trees formed a canopy of green above us. The world felt distant, almost unreal, as we walked hand in hand along the winding paths. "Does this feel strange to you?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He stopped, turning to face me. "What do you mean?" "This," I gestured between us. "Us." He took a step closer, his hands finding mine. "It feels like the most real thing I've ever known." His words melted away my doubts. At least for the moment. We sat together on a wooden bench, the sound of birdsong filling the air as he wrapped his arm around my shoulders. I rested my head against him, letting myself believe, if only briefly, that this was normal. But as much as we tried to keep our affair hidden, cracks began to form in our carefully constructed facade. It started with Mrs. Harrington, our overly curious neighbor, who had an uncanny ability to appear at the most inconvenient times. One morning, as Julian left the house for class, she waved at him from her porch, a knowing smile on her face. "Julian seems to be around a lot more these days," she remarked later when I ran into her at the grocery store. "He's such a devoted stepson." Her words were innocuous, but the way she said them made my stomach churn. I smiled politely and changed the subject, but the encounter left me uneasy. Then there was Liam, Julian's best friend, who came over one evening to study. I stayed out of their way, retreating to my office, but I couldn't ignore the hushed conversation that floated through the walls. "You've been acting weird lately," Liam said. "Like, distracted." Julian's response was too quiet for me to hear, but whatever he said didn't seem to satisfy Liam. "You know you can tell me anything, right?" Liam pressed. "If there's something going on." Their conversation ended abruptly when I accidentally knocked over a stack of papers on my desk. A few minutes later, Julian appeared in my doorway, his expression unreadable. "Everything okay?" I asked, forcing a smile. "Yeah," he said, though his tone was tight. "Liam's just nosy." I didn't push further, but the tension in his voice lingered in the back of my mind. Our most daring encounter happened one evening when I was supposed to meet a client at the library. The meeting was canceled at the last minute, but I decided to stay and browse. The library had always been a refuge for me, a place where I could lose myself in the quiet comfort of books. I didn't expect Julian to show up. "What are you doing here?" I asked, my voice a mix of surprise and delight. "I was passing by," he said with a mischievous grin. "Thought I'd find you here." We wandered through the aisles together, our shoulders brushing as we pulled books from the shelves. In a quiet corner of the library, hidden from view, he kissed me, his hands cupping my face as the world outside faded away. "This is crazy," I murmured against his lips. "Maybe," he said, his voice low. "But it's ours." As the weeks went on, the stakes grew higher. The more time we spent together, the harder it became to keep our feelings hidden. Julian didn't seem to care about the risks, but I couldn't ignore them. The fear of being discovered hung over me like a storm cloud, growing darker with each passing day. It wasn't just the fear of what others would think. It was the knowledge that this couldn't last. Julian was young, with his whole life ahead of him. I was not. The age difference between us was more than just a number. It was a chasm that I knew we couldn't bridge forever. But for now, I clung to the moments we shared, savoring them like stolen treasures. I told myself that I'd end it soon, that I'd find a way to let him go before it was too late. One evening, as we lay tangled together on the couch, Julian traced circles on my arm with his fingertips. "I don't want this to end," he said quietly. "Julian," I began, but he cut me off. "I mean it, Eleanor. I know it's complicated, but I don't care. I don't care about the rules or what people might think. I care about you." His words broke something inside me. I wanted to believe him, to let myself fall completely, but the voice of reason in my head wouldn't be silenced. "I care about you too," I admitted, my voice trembling. "But it's not sustainable. You know that." "We'll figure it out," he said, his tone filled with determination. I wanted to believe him, but deep down I knew the truth. Our affair was like a flame, intense, beautiful, but destined to burn out. The inevitability of discovery lingered in my mind like a shadow, but I had convinced myself we were careful enough to avoid it. It wasn't just the fear of others finding out that terrified me. It was the thought of what would happen to Julian, to us, once the delicate balance we'd maintained came crashing down. The first crack in our facade came during an unassuming afternoon. I was in the kitchen preparing lunch when Mrs. Harrington knocked on the door. She never visited unannounced, so her sudden appearance set my nerves on edge. "I was just dropping by to return your pie dish," she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "And to check in on you. I've noticed Julian's car has been here a lot lately. I hope he's not giving you too much trouble." Her tone was casual, but her words carried an undertone that made my stomach tighten. "No trouble at all," I said, forcing a smile. "He's busy with school, but it's nice having him around." "Good," she replied, her gaze lingering on me for a moment too long before she handed me the dish and left. I closed the door, my heart pounding. She knew something. Maybe not the full truth, but enough to make me wary. Later that evening, Julian and I sat in the living room, the TV playing in the background. I told him about Mrs. Harrington's visit, trying to gauge his reaction. "She's just nosy," he said dismissively, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed his calm demeanor. "It's not just her, Julian," I said, lowering my voice. "People are starting to notice. We can't keep doing this." He turned to face me, his eyes filled with determination. "I don't care what people think, Eleanor. I care about you." His words were meant to reassure me, but they only heightened my anxiety. Things took a sharper turn when Julian's best friend, Liam, showed up unannounced one evening. I was in my study when I heard their voices in the living room, low and intense. "You've been acting weird, man," Liam said. "Like, really weird. What's going on?" "Nothing," Julian replied, but his tone was defensive. "Don't lie to me," Liam pressed. "Is it about Eleanor?" My breath caught. I stepped closer to the door, straining to hear. "What about her?" Julian asked, his voice steady but guarded. "I don't know," Liam said. "You just seem different when you're around her. It's like you're hiding something." Julian didn't respond, and the silence stretched on until Liam finally sighed. "If there's something going on, just be careful, okay? People talk." The real unraveling began when I received a job offer from a prestigious publishing house in another state. It was the kind of opportunity I had dreamed of for years, but accepting it would mean leaving everything behind, including Julian. When I told him about the offer, his reaction was immediate. "You're leaving?" he asked, his voice sharp with disbelief. "I haven't decided yet," I said, trying to keep my tone calm. "You're running away," he accused, standing and pacing the room. "Julian, this is my career," I said, struggling to make him understand. I've worked so hard for this. And what about us? He demanded, his voice breaking. There can't be an us, I said quietly. The words hung in the air like a knife between us. He stared at me, his expression a mixture of hurt and anger. In the days that followed, we barely spoke. The house felt colder, emptier, as the distance between us grew. I spent my nights poring over the details of the job offer, trying to convince myself it was the right choice. But one night, as I sat at my desk, Julian appeared in the doorway. I'm not giving up on you, he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his eyes. Julian, please, I began, but he shook his head. I don't care how complicated it is, he said. I love you, Eleanor. The words hit me like a wave, overwhelming and undeniable. I wanted to tell him I loved him too, but the weight of our situation held me back. The breaking point came when I discovered that Mrs. Harrington had spoken to one of my clients during a chance encounter at the grocery store. She mentioned something about your stepson living with you, my client said casually during a phone call. She seemed curious about your dynamic. I hung up, my hands trembling. It was only a matter of time before the rumors spread further, before our secret became public knowledge. When Julian came home that evening, I told him everything. We can't keep doing this, I said, my voice breaking. It's too risky. Eleanor, I don't care what people think, he said, his voice filled with desperation. But I do, I replied, tears streaming down my face. For the first time, I saw fear in his eyes. He stepped closer, his hands cupping my face as he whispered, I can't lose you. You never had me to begin with, I said, the words cutting deeper than I intended. The confrontation left us both shattered. Julian retreated to his room, and I spent the night staring at the ceiling, wondering how we'd let things go so far. By the time the sun rose, I had made my decision. The morning after my sleepless night, I resolved to put an end to everything. The affair, the secrecy, the moments that had made me feel alive for the first time in years. It all had to stop. The risk was too great, and the damage we'd cause, too profound. Julian emerged from his room just as I finished pouring myself a cup of coffee. His hair was disheveled, and the dark circles under his eyes mirrored my own exhaustion. We need to talk, I said, setting the cup down. I know, he replied, his voice subdued. We sat across from each other at the dining table, the weight of unspoken words heavy in the air. This can't continue, I began, my hands trembling as I clasped them together. It's not fair to you, and it's not fair to me. Fair? He echoed, his tone laced with frustration. Since when has any of this been about fairness? Julian. No, let me finish, he interrupted, his voice rising. I know this isn't conventional. I know people wouldn't understand. But I don't care about them. I care about us. His words stirred something deep within me, a mixture of longing and regret, but I couldn't let myself be swayed. There is no us, I said softly, my voice breaking. This was a mistake. His expression shifted, the hurt in his eyes cutting me to the core. You don't mean that, he said, his voice trembling. I do, I lied, forcing the words out even as my heart screamed otherwise. You need to move on, Julian. Find someone your age, someone who can give you the life you deserve. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. You don't get to decide what I deserve, he said, his voice sharp with anger. I watched helplessly as he stormed out of the house, the door slamming shut behind him. The silence that followed was deafening. For the first time in months, the house felt unbearably empty. I tried to focus on work, but my thoughts kept drifting to Julian, where he'd gone, what he was thinking, whether I'd made the right choice. Hours passed with no word from him. I resisted the urge to call, telling myself he needed time to process everything. But as night fell, my worry grew. Finally, just past midnight, the sound of the front door opening startled me from my restless thoughts. I rushed to the living room, relief flooding through me when I saw Julian standing there, his shoulders slumped and his expression weary. Where have you been? I demanded, unable to hide the concern in my voice. Out, he replied curtly, avoiding my gaze. Julian, I'm done talking, he said, cutting me off. I get it, Eleanor. You don't want this. You don't want me. His words were like a dagger to my chest, but I didn't correct him. How could I, when I'd already made my decision? He walked past me, heading to his room without another word. The sound of his door closing was like the final nail in the coffin of whatever we'd shared. The next few days were agonizing, Julian barely spoke to me, and when he did, his words were clipped and distant. The house felt colder, emptier, as if the life had been drained from it. I threw myself into work, hoping it would distract me, but even that proved futile. My thoughts were consumed by memories of him, his touch, his smile, the way he'd looked at me as if I were the only thing that mattered. One evening, I received an unexpected phone call from the publishing house offering me the job. The editor on the other end was warm and enthusiastic, outlining the details of the position and emphasizing how much they were looking forward to having me on board. "It's a big opportunity," she said. "We hope you'll accept." I thanked her and promised to give them my decision soon, but as I hung up, the weight of the choice before me felt suffocating. That night, Julian confronted me. "I saw the email," he said, standing in the doorway of my study. "What email?" I asked, feigning ignorance. "The one about the job," he said, stepping inside. "You're taking it, aren't you?" I sighed, setting down my pen. "Julian, this isn't about you. Of course it's about me," he said, his voice rising. "You're running away because of what happened between us." "I'm taking the job because it's a good opportunity," I said firmly. "This has nothing to do with you." "Stop lying," he said, his tone raw with emotion. "You're scared, Eleanor. Scared of what people will think. Scared of how much you feel for me." His words hit too close to the truth, and I looked away, unable to meet his gaze. "You're wrong," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. "Am I?" he challenged, stepping closer. "Tell me you don't feel anything for me. Tell me last night meant nothing." I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. The silence stretched between us, heavy and oppressive. "I thought so," he said, his voice softening. "You can lie to yourself all you want, but you can't lie to me." Julian left the room, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I stared at the email on my computer screen, the cursor blinking as if waiting for me to make a decision. I knew what I had to do. The day I left was gray and overcast, the kind of weather that made everything feel heavier. I had packed my things quietly, not wanting to disturb Julian. He had barely spoken to me since our last argument, and part of me hoped the silence was his way of letting me go. The publishing house had arranged for a moving service to help me settle into my new home. As I loaded the last box into the car, I paused, glancing back at the house. The memories of the past months played in my mind like a film reel. The laughter, the arguments, the stolen moments that had defined us. Julian appeared in the doorway, his hands shoved into his pockets. He looked tired, his usual confidence replaced by something softer, more vulnerable. "You're really going," he said, his voice flat. I nodded, unsure of what to say. "For what it's worth," he continued, stepping closer, "I don't regret any of it." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. "Neither do I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. We stood there for a moment, the weight of everything we couldn't say hanging between us. Finally, I reached out, my hand brushing against his. "Take care of yourself, Julian," I said, tears welling in my eyes. "You too," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. I wanted to say more, to tell him how much he had meant to me, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I got into the car and drove away, leaving behind the house, the memories, and the man I had fallen for. The weeks that followed were a blur of meetings, deadlines, and adjusting to my new life. The job was everything I had hoped for, challenging and fulfilling in ways I hadn't experienced in years. But no matter how busy I kept myself, I couldn't shake the emptiness that had settled in my chest. Every so often, I'd catch myself thinking about Julian, wondering what he was doing, if he was happy, if he thought of me as often as I thought of him. One evening, as I walked through the city, I passed by a bookstore. In the window was a display of novels, their colorful covers beckoning passers-by. My eyes landed on one title in particular, Desires of the Middle-Aged Heart. I couldn't help but smile, the memory of that fateful day flooding back. That book had been the catalyst, the spark that had ignited something neither of us could have anticipated. I stepped inside, running my fingers along the spines of the books as I wandered through the aisles. For a moment, I let myself imagine a different version of our story, one where the world wasn't so complicated, where we could have been together without fear or judgment. But life wasn't a storybook, and happy endings weren't guaranteed. As the months turned into years, I carried the memory of Julian with me like a keepsake tucked away in a drawer. I didn't dwell on it, but it never truly faded. It was a reminder of what it meant to feel alive, to take risks, to love without reservation, even when the odds were stacked against you. Looking back, I realized that what we had wasn't about right or wrong. It was about being human, flawed, vulnerable, and desperately searching for connection in a world that often felt too big and too cold. And though our time together was fleeting, it was real. It mattered.
It was a routine call for a minor repair, nothing special at first. I hadn't thought much about it. I was 60, living alone in a quiet, predictable world, untouched by the excitement of desire for longer than I cared to admit. But that Wednesday afternoon, when Jacob stepped through my door young, strong, and filled with a nervous charm, I felt something shift inside me. What started as an innocent moment soon spiraled into something far more dangerous. Our meetings, once professional, became filled with tension, and as I crossed boundaries I hadn't even known existed, the line between need and obsession blurred. I hadn't planned for this, hadn't expected it. But it had awakened something in me I could no longer ignore. I had been staring at the dripping sink for days, watching the water collect in the basin, a constant reminder of how little attention I paid to my surroundings now. After years of carefully curated home improvements, everything seemed pointless without someone to share them with. The house had grown too big after my divorce, each room echoing with memories I tried not to think about. The kitchen, once the center of our family life, had fallen into a quiet disrepair, much like me. So when the sink leak became too much to ignore, I did something I hadn't done in a long time. I called for help. I found a local handyman, Jacob. The name didn't mean anything to me, just someone to get the job done. I expected a grizzled old man, experienced, maybe a little rough around the edges, but when I opened the door that chilly Wednesday afternoon, I found myself staring at a young man in his 20s. Jacob stood there, towering over me, a toolbox in hand, wearing a simple gray shirt that stretched across his broad chest. He had a nervous smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, but there was something about him that immediately drew me in. "Hi, I'm here to take a look at the sink," he said, his voice deep but soft. I blinked, startled for a moment by the way my heart skipped just slightly in my chest. It was an absurd reaction, really. At my age, those little sparks were supposed to be things of the past, and yet there it was, a flicker of something I hadn't felt in years. "Come in," I managed to say, stepping aside to let him into the house. I watched him as he moved through the space, his eyes scanning the kitchen with quiet focus. There was an efficiency to the way he worked, kneeling down to inspect the sink, his hands moving expertly over the pipes. I found myself lingering nearby, unable to look away. I stood by the kitchen island, pretending to be busy with something else, but my attention never left him. There was something about the way he moved, the strength in his arms as he tightened the bolts under the sink, the quiet concentration etched on his face. I hadn't been this close to a young man in years. I hadn't even thought about what it would be like until now. I couldn't quite explain it, but something inside me stirred. It wasn't just about his looks, though Jacob was undeniably attractive in that rugged, effortless way. No, it was the energy he brought into the room, a vitality that contrasted sharply with the silence that had settled over my life. There was a warmth to him, something I hadn't felt in so long. For a moment I caught myself leaning against the counter, watching him too closely. I adjusted my robe, I had never considered provocative until now, and straightened up, trying to shake the ridiculous thoughts that were creeping into my mind. Jacob looked up from his work, catching my eye. I could see the flicker of surprise in his expression as his gaze traveled quickly over me, then darted back to the sink. His cheeks flushed slightly, and I couldn't help but feel a small thrill at the reaction. It was innocent enough, but I felt something stirring that I hadn't allowed myself to feel for so long: desire. I walked over to where he was kneeling, watching as he worked. He was focused, but there was an undercurrent of nervousness in the way his hands moved, as if he were trying not to acknowledge my presence too much. "Everything going okay down there?" I asked, my voice softer than I intended. He nodded, not looking up. "Yeah, just a small leak. Should be fixed in a few minutes." I couldn't help myself. I reached out and lightly touched his shoulder, just a gentle squeeze. His body tensed under my hand, and I felt the thrill of power that came with knowing I had affected him. It was a feeling I hadn't experienced in years, and I wasn't ready to let it go just yet. "You're really strong," I said, my voice taking on a slightly more flirtatious tone. He looked up at me, startled, his face flushing even more. Thanks." I smiled at him, a soft, knowing smile. I could feel the tension building between us, thickening the air in the small space of my kitchen. It was unspoken, but it was there. He shifted uncomfortably, clearly trying to stay professional, but the way his hands trembled slightly as he tightened the last bolt told me everything I needed to know. I stepped a little closer, leaning over the counter, watching his every move. He stood up, wiping his hands on a rag, and I could see the way he was avoiding my gaze now, trying to maintain his composure. "You need any help?" I asked, knowing full well he didn't. He shook his head quickly, focusing on packing up his tools, but his hands were shaking. I reached out again, this time letting my fingers brush against his arm, feeling the warmth of his skin under my touch. He froze for a moment, and I could see the internal struggle playing out in his eyes. There was a part of him that wanted to give in, I could tell, but there was also a part of him that knew better. He was younger, and I was a woman who should have known better too. But in that moment, it didn't matter. I let my hand linger on his arm, feeling the tension between us crackle like electricity. He looked at me, his breath shallow, his eyes wide and uncertain. For a moment I thought he might step forward, close the distance between us, but then he took a step back, breaking the spell. He stammered, his voice shaky. "I'm just here to fix the sink." I smiled softly, amused by how flustered he was. "Are you sure there's nothing else that needs fixing?" I asked, my voice teasing now. He looked like he didn't know whether to stay or run. His hands were trembling as he gathered the last of his tools, and I could see the way he was struggling to maintain control. I took a step closer, my lips just inches from his. "There's something else you could take care of for me," I whispered, my voice low and suggestive. He didn't respond, just stared at me, frozen in place. I leaned in, as if I were about to kiss him again, but before I could, he took a quick step back, his hands up in front of him as if to ward me off. "I can't," he said, shaking his head. "I really can't." I pouted, feeling a little disappointed, but I knew he wasn't going to give in. Not yet, anyway. He left in a hurry, practically running out of the house, leaving me standing there in the kitchen, alone again. But there was something about the way he left. It wasn't just the awkwardness. There was a tension that hung in the air, something unfinished, something unresolved. And I knew, deep down, that while Jacob had said no, it wasn't because he wasn't interested. It was because he didn't trust himself not to say yes. The days that followed were a strange mix of excitement and frustration. I couldn't stop thinking about Jacob, about the way he had hesitated, the way his eyes had lingered on me just a little too long. It had been years since I'd felt this way, since I'd felt anything, really, and now suddenly there was this young man who had stirred something inside me, something I thought had long since died. I didn't expect to see him again. I figured he had probably told himself he wouldn't come back, that he couldn't come back. But then, about a week later, my phone rang. I didn't recognize the number, but when I answered, it was him. "Hi, this is Jacob, the plumber. I was just calling to check if everything's okay with the sink. Did the fix hold up?" His voice was polite, professional even, but I could hear the tremble beneath it. He was nervous, and that thrilled me more than I cared to admit. "Oh, Jacob," I said, trying to keep my tone casual, though I knew exactly where this was going. "Funny you should ask. The sink is fine, but there's another issue in the bathroom I was hoping you could take a look at. It's probably nothing major, but I wouldn't feel right if I didn't have a professional check it out." There was a pause on the other end of the line. I could hear him weighing his options, deciding whether he should come back. "I can be there in about an hour," he said finally. When I hung up, I couldn't help but smile to myself. This time, I had no intention of letting him off so easily. When Jacob arrived, he was visibly more nervous than the first time. He tried to maintain his usual calm, professional demeanor, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he avoided my gaze as I led him upstairs to the bathroom. The issue with the faucet was minor, just a loose handle, but I knew it wasn't the faucet that brought him back. As he worked, I stood nearby, watching him in silence. The air between us was thick with unspoken tension, the kind that made my skin tingle. He was more focused this time, keeping his head down, his eyes on the work. But I could tell he was more aware of me now, more aware of the space between us. I couldn't resist any longer. "Jacob," I said softly, stepping a little closer, "I've been thinking about you." He paused for a moment, his hand tightening around the faucet. He didn't look up, but I could see the way his knuckles turned white, the way his breathing quickened just slightly. His voice was cautious, like he wasn't sure if he should acknowledge what had happened before. "I haven't been able to stop thinking about last time," I continued, my voice low, intimate. "You seemed interested, but you held back. Why was that?" He didn't answer at first, his hands still working on the faucet, but I could see the conflict in his eyes. I'm a professional," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "It wouldn't be right." "Wouldn't it?" I asked, stepping even closer now. I could feel the heat radiating off him. "Who says what's right or wrong, Jacob? You're a grown man, and I'm a grown woman. We both know there's something here, something between us. You can feel it, can't you?" He looked at me then, his jaw clenched, his eyes filled with the same conflict that had been there the last time. He was struggling, I could see it. He was trying so hard to stay professional, to keep that distance between us. But the tension had already built to the point of no return, and I wasn't about to let it go now. I let my hand brush against his chest, feeling his heartbeat racing beneath my fingertips. His breathing hitched, and for a moment I thought he might step back again, but then without warning he reached out and grabbed my arm, pulling me toward him. It wasn't rough, but it was firm. His face was inches from mine now, his breath warm against my skin. "Margaret," he said, his voice low and intense, "this isn't a game." "I never said it was," I replied, my lips curling into a smile. There was no going back now. Jacob's hands were still on my arm, firm but hesitant, as if he didn't trust himself to let go. There was something raw and unguarded in his expression now, no more of the nervous politeness he had shown before. His eyes locked onto mine, and I could feel the tension between us shift into something deeper, something far more dangerous. I leaned in closer, letting my lips hover just inches from his. His grip tightened slightly, as though he was both holding me closer and trying to push me away at the same time. For a brief moment I wondered if he would break, if he would walk out the door and never come back. But then his breathing quickened, and I knew he was feeling the same thing I was. "Sometimes you just have to let go," I whispered, my voice barely audible, but filled with an unmistakable promise. And Jacob hesitated for one more beat, and then, as if something snapped inside him, he pulled me even closer and kissed me. It wasn't gentle or tentative like before. This kiss was filled with the weight of everything we had both been holding back. His lips moved against mine with a kind of urgency that sent a shiver down my spine, his hands gripping my waist as if he were afraid to let go. I kissed him back, my arms wrapping around his neck, pulling him closer still, feeling the heat between us building with every second. The world around us seemed to blur, the bathroom, the sink, the leak, all of it disappeared as his touch consumed me. His hands slid down to my hips, and I could feel the tension in his body, the way he was holding himself back, afraid of going too far but already too far gone. We pulled apart just long enough to catch our breath, our foreheads resting against each other, our breathing ragged and uneven. I could feel his heart pounding against his chest, his pulse racing beneath my fingers. The look in his eyes told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't just a moment of weakness for him. This was something he had been fighting for a long time, something he hadn't wanted to admit to himself. "What now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, his eyes searching mine for answers. I smiled, stepping back just enough to give him some space but not too far. I could feel the pull between us, the undeniable connection that had brought us to this point. "I think you know the answer to that, Jacob," I said softly, my voice filled with a quiet confidence I hadn't felt in years. "We've already crossed the line. Why stop now?" For a moment he didn't say anything. He just stood there watching me, the conflict still flickering in his eyes. But then, with one last glance at the door, he reached for me again, his hands finding their way back to my waist, pulling me closer. This time, there was no hesitation, no second thoughts. This time, we both knew exactly what we were doing. The rest of that afternoon passed in a blur. Jacob and I barely made it out of the bathroom, the tension between us finally unraveling in a way that felt both inevitable and exhilarating. His hands were everywhere, my shoulders, my waist, my hips, his touch firm yet respectful, as if he were letting go of control but still holding on to some semblance of restraint. But I didn't want restraint. Not now. I hadn't felt like this in years, not since before the divorce. My life had been filled with routine for so long, dinners alone, quiet nights in front of the TV, the occasional call from my grown children. I hadn't realized how much I had been craving this, how much I needed to feel wanted again, desired. Jacob kissed me deeply, his lips trailing down my neck, his hands sliding down to grip my hips. I let out a soft gasp, my head falling back as I gave in to the moment. There was something intoxicating about being with him, this young, strong man who seemed to see me in a way no one had in so long. It was more than just physical attraction, it was a connection that went deeper, something neither of us had expected but couldn't deny. We eventually made our way to the bedroom, the air between us charged with a kind of energy I hadn't felt in years. As we lay together, tangled in the sheets, I couldn't help but smile to myself, feeling more alive than I had in what felt like a lifetime. "I've never done anything like this," Jacob murmured, his voice low and husky as he lay beside me, his fingers tracing lazy circles on my arm. "Neither have I admitted, my voice just as soft. He turned to look at me, his expression filled with something I hadn't expected, vulnerability. "I shouldn't have," he said, shaking his head slightly, "but I don't regret it." I placed my hand on his chest, feeling his heartbeat beneath my fingertips, and smiled softly. "Neither do I." We lay there in silence for a while after that, both of us lost in our own thoughts. The weight of what had just happened hung in the air between us, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was as if we had both crossed a line we didn't know existed, but neither of us wanted to go back. Eventually, Jacob sat up, glancing at the clock. "I should go," he said, his voice filled with a reluctance that mirrored my own. "I've been here longer than I planned." "You don't have to," I said, though I knew he couldn't stay. He hesitated, looking at me like he wanted to stay, but then he shook his head. "I don't want this to be awkward," he said, his voice soft but firm. I don't want you to think I was just. I smiled, understanding what he meant. I don't, I said, sitting up beside him. You're a good man, Jacob. We both needed this, and I'm glad it happened. But I'm not expecting anything more than what this was. He looked relieved, though there was still a hint of confusion in his eyes, like he wasn't used to things being this simple. So you're really okay with everything? No weird feelings or anything? I laughed softly, shaking my head. No, Jacob, no weird feelings. It was just one of those moments. No strings, no pressure. He nodded slowly, as if he were still trying to process the simplicity of it all. Okay, he said after a long pause. I guess I'll see you around. Maybe, I said, teasing him just a little. If my sink breaks again, you'll be the first one I call. That made him smile, and he stood up, grabbing his tools and slinging his bag over his shoulder. But before he left, he turned back to me one last time. Margaret, he said, his voice soft but filled with sincerity, I don't regret it. I just want you to know that. I smiled, watching as he opened the door. Neither do I. And just like that, he was gone. In the days that followed, I found myself thinking about Jacob more than I should have. Every time I walked past the sink, I remembered the way he had looked at me, the way his hands had trembled slightly when I touched his arm. I remembered the heat of his kiss, the way his body had pressed against mine, the way he had hesitated, then finally given in. It had been so long since I had felt like that, since I had felt anything like that. I hadn't expected him to call again. I figured he had probably convinced himself it was a one-time thing, that it shouldn't happen again, and maybe he was right. Maybe it shouldn't have happened in the first place. But I didn't regret it. Not for a second. Still, I wasn't sure if I'd ever see him again. I wasn't even sure if I wanted to. The rational part of me knew that this was dangerous territory, that there was an age gap, a power dynamic, societal expectations, and the very real possibility that we were playing with fire. But the part of me that had felt so alive in his arms didn't care about any of that. I knew that if he called, I wouldn't say no. And then, one afternoon, about a week after he had left, my phone rang. The moment I saw his name flash on my phone screen, my heart skipped a beat. I hadn't been expecting it, hadn't even been hoping for it, but there it was, his name, his number, a doorway back to the thrill of what we'd shared. Hey, his voice was tentative, cautious, like he wasn't sure if he should be calling. I wanted to check on the faucet, make sure everything's still working fine. There was a pause, and I could hear the uncertainty in his voice, as though he were trying to convince himself that this was still just a professional call. But we both knew better. The faucet is fine, I replied, letting my voice drop just slightly, enough to let him know that I wasn't talking about the sink. But there's another issue you might be able to help me with. Another pause. I could almost hear his heartbeat quickening on the other end of the line, the hesitation that told me he was weighing his options, deciding whether or not he should come back. I'll be there in an hour, Jacob said, his voice barely above a whisper, like he was unsure of the decision he had just made. But I knew deep down that once again he couldn't stay away any more than I could resist asking him back. When I hung up the phone, a wave of anticipation washed over me. It had been a long time since I felt this kind of excitement, a mixture of nervous energy and raw desire, coursing through me like a current. I told myself it was just a momentary indulgence, nothing serious, nothing lasting. But the truth was, it had already become more than that. I spent the next hour pacing around the house, straightening up things that didn't really need to be straightened, trying to calm the excitement that was building inside me. This wasn't like me. I had never been the type to lose control, to let myself get swept up in something so reckless. But with Jacob, all of those carefully constructed walls I'd built over the years seemed to crumble. When he finally arrived, I felt that same rush all over again. He stood in the doorway, hesitant but clearly drawn to the pull between us. His eyes met mine, and I saw the same flicker of uncertainty that had been there the last time. But there was something else, too, something darker, more intense. He stepped inside, and I could feel the electricity between us grow. We didn't say much as I led him to the bathroom, pretending that I had some small issue that needed fixing, but we both knew why he was really there. As soon as we were alone in the bathroom, the air between us shifted. Jacob tried to focus on the task at hand, his hands fiddling with the faucet, but I could see the way his fingers trembled slightly. He was nervous, but so was I. Nervous about what we were doing, but more than that, nervous about how much I wanted this. I stepped closer, watching as he pretended to inspect the faucet, his body tense, his eyes fixed on the task. The silence between us was heavy, thick with unspoken desire. Finally, I couldn't take it any more. I reached out, placing my hand lightly on his shoulder, feeling the warmth of his skin through his shirt. Jacob froze under my touch, his entire body going rigid. For a moment he didn't move, didn't even breathe. But then, slowly, he turned to face me, his eyes filled with the same conflict I had seen before. "Jacob," I whispered, my voice soft but insistent, "you don't have to pretend anymore." His breath hitched, and for a moment I thought he might pull away again, that he might leave just like last time. But then something shifted in him. His expression changed, his resolve breaking, his defenses crumbling, and without another word, he pulled me into his arms, his lips crashing against mine with a force that left me breathless. It was different this time. There was no hesitation, no second-guessing. This time Jacob wasn't holding back. His hands roamed over my body, his touch filled with a kind of urgency that sent shivers down my spine. I kissed him back, my fingers tangling in his hair as I pressed myself closer to him, losing myself in the intensity of the moment. We didn't stop. Not this time. The bathroom felt too small, too confined for what was happening between us. Without breaking the kiss, Jacob lifted me up, carrying me to the bedroom where the boundaries between us dissolved entirely. The hours that followed were a blur of sensation and emotion, the world outside fading away as we gave in to the desire we had both tried so hard to ignore. Jacob's hands moved over my body with a kind of reverence, a need that matched my own, and in those moments nothing else mattered. I felt alive, more alive than I had in years. It was as if the years had melted away, and I was no longer the woman who had spent so much of her life wrapped in routine, in the quiet loneliness of a big, empty house. With Jacob I felt wanted, desired. There was no shame, no guilt, only the heat between us, and the shared understanding that we both needed this. Jacob's touch was both tender and demanding, a mixture of control and release. He kissed me with a hunger that took me by surprise, his lips exploring mine with a passion that made my heart race. I kissed him back with equal fervor, pulling him closer, unwilling to let the moment slip away. As we lay tangled together afterward, our bodies spent, the silence between us was comforting rather than awkward. I could feel Jacob's breath on my neck, slow and steady, as his fingers absent-mindedly traced patterns on my skin. I closed my eyes, savoring the warmth of his body next to mine, the weight of his presence. Neither of us spoke for a long time. There was no need for words. We both knew what had just happened was more than just a fleeting moment of passion. It was something deeper, something that neither of us had expected but couldn't deny. For the first time in years, I felt truly seen, not as a 60-year-old woman, not as someone's ex-wife, but as a person, as a woman who still had the capacity to feel, to desire, to live. But reality has a way of creeping back in, no matter how much you try to hold it at bay. As the hours passed, I began to feel the weight of what had happened settling over me. Jacob was young, so much younger than me, and while the age difference hadn't seemed to matter in the heat of the moment, I knew it couldn't be ignored forever. I glanced over at Jacob, who was still lying beside me, his eyes closed, his breathing even and peaceful. He looked content, but I wondered how long that contentment would last, how long before he realized the complications of what we were doing, how long before he started to pull away. The thought of it sent a pang of fear through me. I hadn't planned for this. I hadn't planned to feel anything more than a passing attraction. But now, lying here beside him, I knew it was more than that. I had grown attached to him, more attached than I had ever intended. I sat up slowly, careful not to wake him, and wrapped the blanket around myself. I stared out the window, watching as the last rays of the afternoon sun disappeared behind the trees, leaving the room bathed in a soft, golden glow. This couldn't last. I knew that. The rational part of me knew that this was temporary, that whatever we had shared was fleeting. But another part of me, a part one, hadn't acknowledged until now, wanted it to last, wanted Jacob to stay. And that terrified me. The days that followed were filled with a strange mixture of longing and uncertainty. Jacob and I continued to see each other, but something had changed. He was still kind, still attentive, but there was a distance between us now, an unspoken tension that neither of us could ignore. I knew it wasn't intentional. Jacob was trying to hold on to whatever we had, but I could see the conflict in his eyes every time we were together. He was young, with his whole life ahead of him, and I couldn't help but wonder if he had started to regret the path we had taken. The age difference, which had once felt like a thrilling taboo, now seemed to loom over us like a shadow. I could see the way people looked at us when we were out in public, the curious glances, the judgmental stares. It didn't matter that I felt younger when I was with Jacob, that he made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. To the outside world, we were something unnatural, something that didn't fit. And slowly I began to feel the weight of that judgment. One evening, as we sat together on the couch, Jacob reached for my hand. His touch was warm, comforting, but there was something in his eyes that made my heart sink. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice hesitant, as though he wasn't sure how to begin. "About us." I felt a lump form in my throat, but I nodded, urging him to continue. "This is complicated, Margaret," he said, his voice soft but firm. "I don't regret anything, but I don't know how to make this work." I knew what he meant. I had been dreading this conversation, but I knew it was inevitable. We had crossed a line, and now we were both struggling to figure out where we stood. "You don't have to explain," I said, my voice calm, even though my heart was racing. "I know this is difficult." Jacob looked at me, his eyes filled with a sadness that I hadn't expected. "I don't want to hurt you," he said, "but I can't keep pretending that this is normal." His words hit me like a punch to the gut, but I forced myself to stay composed. I had known this was coming. I had known that our relationship was built on shaky ground, that it couldn't last forever, but knowing it didn't make it any easier. After that conversation, things between us began to unravel. We still saw each other, but the easy intimacy we had once shared was gone, replaced by an awkwardness that neither of us could shake. I could feel Jacob pulling away, bit by bit, even though he was trying not to. I didn't want to admit it, but I was afraid. Afraid of losing him, afraid of going back to the life I had before. The quiet loneliness of my house, the empty days that stretched out in front of me, it all seemed unbearable now, after everything I had felt with Jacob. One evening I sat alone in the living room, staring at my phone, willing it to ring. Jacob had promised to come by that afternoon, but hours had passed, and there had been no sign of him. I felt a knot of anxiety forming in my chest. He was pulling away, and I didn't know how to stop it. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Jacob. "I'm sorry I can't make it tonight. I need some time to think." I stared at the message, my heart sinking. I had known this was coming, but seeing it spelled out in black and white made it all the more real. I didn't respond. I didn't know how to. Instead, I sat there in the dark, the quiet of the house pressing in on me like a weight I couldn't escape. The thrill that had once filled me was gone, replaced by a hollow emptiness that I hadn't expected. I had thought that this was just a fling, something that would make me feel alive for a little while before we both moved on, but it was more than that now. I had let myself care for him, and now I was paying the price. A week passed, and Jacob didn't call. I tried to keep myself busy, filling my days with tasks that didn't really matter, but the emptiness followed me everywhere. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was ending, that whatever we had shared was slipping through my fingers, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. And then one evening, just as the sun was setting, my phone rang. It was Jacob. "Can I come over?" he asked, his voice quiet, almost hesitant. Of course I replied, though I already knew what was coming. When he arrived, there was a tension in the air that hadn't been there before. He looked tired, as though he hadn't slept in days, and I could see the conflict etched in every line of his face. We sat down in the living room, the silence between us heavy with unspoken words. I waited for him to speak, but he seemed to be struggling with what to say. "Margaret," he began, his voice soft, "I've been doing a lot of thinking." I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. "I care about you," he continued, his eyes locking onto mine, "more than I ever thought I would. But I can't keep doing this. I can't pretend that the age difference doesn't matter. I can't pretend that this isn't complicated." I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes, but I forced them back, determined to stay composed. I had known this was coming, but that didn't make it any easier. "I understand," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Jacob looked at me, his expression filled with regret. "I don't want to hurt you, Margaret, but I think it's best if we end this now before it gets even more complicated." I nodded, unable to find the words to respond. I had known all along that this couldn't last, but knowing it didn't make the pain any less real. Jacob reached for my hand, squeezing it gently, as if trying to comfort me in a moment that offered little solace. His touch was warm, familiar, and yet it felt distant, like a reminder of something that was slipping away. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I never meant for it to get this far, but I just don't know how to make this work." I looked at him, my heart breaking quietly in my chest. He was right. We had crossed a line that had felt exhilarating at the time, but now the reality of it all was sinking in. The age difference, the secrecy, the uncertainty of where this could lead, it was too much, and we both knew it. "I don't regret anything," I said softly, my voice steady despite the lump in my throat. "I don't want you to think that." Jacob's eyes softened, and for a moment I thought I saw a flicker of hesitation, like he was reconsidering his decision. But then, just as quickly, it was gone. "I don't either," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I can't keep pretending that this is something it's not." I nodded, knowing that there was nothing more to say. We had shared something real, something beautiful, but it wasn't meant to last. And that was the hardest part of all, accepting that some things, no matter how powerful they feel in the moment, aren't meant to be forever. For a few moments we just sat there in silence, his hand still wrapped around mine. It was as if we were both trying to hold on to the last shred of what we had, knowing full well that it was already slipping away. Finally, Jacob stood up, his movements slow and deliberate, like he was giving himself time to process what was happening. He glanced around the room, as if committing it to memory, and then looked back at me. "Take care of yourself, Margaret," he said quietly. "You too." "Jacob," I replied, my voice calm but filled with the weight of everything we weren't saying. He lingered for a moment longer, then turned and walked toward the door. I watched him go, my heart aching in a way I hadn't expected. The door closed softly behind him, and just like that, he was gone. The house felt impossibly quiet after he left, the silence pressing in on me like a heavy fog. I sat there for a long time staring at the door, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. The thrill, the connection, the passion, it had all been real. But now it was over. I stood up slowly, my body heavy with exhaustion, and made my way to the bedroom. The bed felt too big, too empty without him beside me, and as I lay there in the dark, I couldn't help but wonder if I had made a mistake. Had I let myself fall too far? Had I allowed myself to feel too much? But even as the sadness washed over me, I knew that I wouldn't change a thing. What I had shared with Jacob had awakened something in me, something I hadn't felt in years. It reminded me that I was still capable of desire, of passion, of living. And for that, I would always be grateful. The days that followed felt like they were moving in slow motion. The quiet routines of my life returned the same familiar patterns, the same empty spaces. But something had changed. Even though Jacob was gone, the spark he had reignited within me still flickered, refusing to die out completely. I found myself thinking about him often. I wondered what he was doing, how he was feeling. I knew that ending things had been the right decision for both of us, but that didn't make the longing disappear. It lingered in the background, a quiet ache that I couldn't quite shake. I tried to distract myself with small tasks, cleaning the house, organizing my bookshelves, taking long walks around the neighborhood. But no matter what I did, the memories of Jacob lingered in the corners of my mind, teasing me with the possibility of what could have been. One afternoon, as I was sorting through some old photo albums, I came across a picture of myself from years ago, young, vibrant, full of life. I stared at it for a long time, trying to reconcile the woman in the photo with the woman I had become. I had spent so many years trying to fit into the mold of what was expected of me, a good wife, a good mother, a responsible adult, but in doing so I had lost a part of myself. Jacob reminded me of that part, the part that longed for adventure, for connection, for something more than just going through the motions. And even though our relationship had ended, I couldn't help but feel grateful for the time we had shared. He had given me something I hadn't realized I needed, a reminder that I was still alive, still capable of feeling. Weeks turned into months, and slowly the ache of missing Jacob began to fade. It didn't disappear completely. There were still moments when I thought of him, when I felt that familiar tug of longing. But those moments became less frequent, and the emptiness in my heart began to fill with something else. Acceptance. I knew now that our relationship had been a temporary reprieve from the monotony of my life, a brief but intense connection that had brought me back to myself. And while it hadn't lasted, it had served its purpose. I had changed. I could feel it in the way I carried myself, in the way I approached my days. The quiet loneliness that had once filled my house no longer felt so suffocating. I had found a way to reclaim my space, to make it my own again. I started reconnecting with old friends, reaching out to people I hadn't spoken to in years. I joined a local book club, something I had always wanted to do but never made the time for. I took up painting, filling my afternoons with splashes of color and creativity that brought me a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. And through it all, I kept the memory of Jacob tucked away in a quiet corner of my heart. I didn't dwell on it, but I didn't push it away either. It was a part of my story now, a chapter that had helped shape the person I was becoming. One evening, months after Jacob had left, I found myself sitting on the back porch, a glass of wine in hand, watching the sun set over the horizon. The sky was painted in shades of pink and gold, the air cool and crisp with the promise of autumn. As I sat there, I realized something I hadn't noticed before. I was content. not just with the quiet, solitary life I had rebuilt for myself, but with the knowledge that I had lived, that I had allowed myself to feel something real, even if it hadn't lasted. Jacob had come into my life unexpectedly, and just as unexpectedly he had left, but the mark he had left on me remained. He had reminded me that life doesn't have to follow a prescribed path, that sometimes the greatest experiences come from the most unexpected places. I took a sip of my wine, smiling to myself as I thought about the future. It was uncertain, of course. I didn't know what lay ahead, but for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of the unknown. I had rediscovered a part of myself that I had thought was lost forever, and that was enough. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I stood up and made my way inside. The house felt warm, welcoming, no longer the cold, empty space it had once been. It was mine now, a reflection of who I was and who I was becoming. And as I closed the door behind me, I couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of hope. Whatever came next, I knew I could face it. Because I had already faced the hardest part, letting go.